You know what this city's problem is? Officer Brad Holloway said it to nobody in particular, staring through the windshield at the Saturday morning crowd filling the plaza below. Nobody's afraid anymore. Nobody understands that when a badge shows up, you stop what you're doing and you pay attention. That's not asking too much. That's just basic respect. His partner, Officer Diana Reyes, kept her eyes on the street and said nothing. 2 miles away, at a corner table in a coffee shop on 16th Avenue, James Caldwell was finishing his first cup of black coffee. No sugar, no cream exact change left on the counter without ceremony. He was 52 years old, tall, with the kind of posture that doesn't come from a gym, but from 2 decades of being told that how you carry yourself is the first thing the enemy sees. His hair was cut close the way it had been cut every 3 weeks for 22 years, even though it had been 14 months since he last wore a uniform. His shoulders were broad in the way of someone who has carried actual weight, not iron, in a climate-controlled gym, but the weight of decisions of men of consequences that followed you home whether you wanted them to or not. He sat with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. It was a habit so deeply embedded in his body that he no longer thought about it. Consciously, he simply could not sit any other way, could not be comfortable unless he could see who was coming in and where the exits were. 22 years in the United States Army does that to a person. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, and 1 morning outside Kandahar in 2009 that left a pale, ragged scar running along the inside of his left forearm. Shrapnel from an IED that his body armor had slowed but not stopped, that had torn through muscle and left him on a medevac helicopter wondering if he would ever use that arm again. He had used it again. He had used it for 13 more years, leading men making decisions, earning a Purple Heart that currently sat in a box in the closet of his apartment 2 miles from this coffee shop because he didn't know what else to do with it. Nobody in this coffee shop knew any of that. The barista who poured his coffee without asking how he took it, because she had learned over 6 Saturday mornings that he always took it black, did not know. The young man in the corner typing furiously on a laptop did not know. The older couple sharing a pastry near the window, talking quietly about their grandchildren, did not know. James was invisible here in the particular way that middle-aged black men are often invisible in public spaces, present taking up space but not seen in any way that registered as significant. And in exactly 1 hour and 20 minutes, that invisibility would become the most important fact of his day. He sipped his coffee slowly, watching the street through the window the way he watched most things, with the steady, patient attention of a man who has learned that the world gives up its intentions if you're willing to wait and watch long enough. His therapist, Dr. Angela Moore, had prescribed these Saturday morning walks 8 months ago, after the 3rd week in a row that he had called her at 4 a.m. because the nightmares had become too loud to stay in bed with. Use the body, she had told him. When the mind gets too heavy, give it something physical to do. Walk, move, put your feet on the ground and remind yourself what century you're in. He had been trying. Some mornings it worked better than others. This morning the street fair outside looked bright and harmless. Banners on the light poles, vendor booths being set up along the plaza, the particular cheerful noise of a city waking up on a weekend, and something in James's chest loosened slightly, the way it sometimes did on mornings when the sun was out, and the world seemed briefly like the place he had once believed he was fighting to protect. He put the empty cup down, left the table, and walked out into the morning. The bell above the door chimed softly behind him. Nobody looked up. Officer Brad Holloway had been on the Denver Police Department for 19 years, and he had a platinum blonde crew cut that had gone silver at the temples in the last 2 years, though he kept it exactly the same length. It had always been close-cropped, precise, the kind of haircut that says the man wearing it believes in order and intends to enforce it. His jaw had a permanent slight tension to it, like a door that has been closed too hard too many times and no longer quite sits right in the frame. He was 46 years old and in good physical shape, the kind of shape that comes from early morning workouts, driven not by health consciousness, but by a need to feel in control of something, anything, at the start of every day. His wife Karen had left him 4 months ago. She had taken their 2 children, a daughter 11 and a son 8, to her mother's house in Aurora and filed for divorce the following week. The paperwork cited a pattern of controlling behavior and documented anger management concerns language that Holloway's own attorney had shown him with the kind of carefully neutral expression that meant even his lawyer wasn't sure he could win. The custody hearing was in 6 weeks, and it was not going well. The judge had used a phrase that Holloway kept turning over in his mind like a stone he couldn't stop picking up, demonstrated inability to accept boundaries imposed by others. He didn't know what that meant, or rather he knew what it meant and refused to accept it, which was perhaps the problem the judge had been describing. This morning he was angrier than usual, and Officer Diana Reyes, who had been his partner for 8 months and had spent most of those 8 months learning to read him. The way you learn to read. Weather watching for the particular signs that meant a storm was forming. Could feel it in the way he gripped the steering wheel and in the way his eyes moved across the crowded plaza with the focused, hungry quality of someone who isn't just observing a scene but looking for something specific to happen to. "What are we looking for today?" Reyes asked, keeping her voice carefully light. She was 29, sharp, and deeply uncomfortable with her partner in a way she hadn't fully allowed herself to name yet. She had become a police officer because she believed in the job, believed in the version of it where you showed up for people who needed help and used authority carefully, and understood that the badge was a responsibility, not a reward. 8 months with Holloway had been a slow, steady education in what happened when a person saw the badge differently. Disrespect, Holloway said, which wasn't an answer to the question she had asked. He was watching a man walking alone through the plaza. A black man in his 50s jeans and a dark blue shirt moving through the morning crowd with a steady, unhurried pace, and a bearing that was to any neutral observer simply the bearing of a person who knew where they were going and was comfortable in their own body. To Reyes, watching through the passenger window, there was nothing unusual about this man. There was nothing that warranted a second look, nothing that suggested any kind of threat or violation. To Holloway, what he saw was a man who was not afraid, a man who had glanced at the patrol car as it slowed near the curb and had not flinched, had not looked away, had not done any of the small, involuntary things that most people do when a police car appears. The slight stiffening, the checking of their own behavior, the unconscious performance of innocence. This man had simply noted the car the way he might note a traffic light and continued walking. And to Holloway, that absence of fear registered as something close to a personal insult. Reyes quietly pulled up dispatch on her phone while Holloway wasn't looking. No robbery reports, no casing complaints, nothing in the plaza area for the last 3 hours. She said nothing. Holloway was already pulling to the curb. Holloway's voice cut through the ambient noise of the street fair the way a fire alarm cuts through a building full of people who are pretending everything is fine, not loud exactly, but carrying a specific authority that made heads turn. "Hey, you in the blue shirt, step over here." James heard it and stopped walking. 22 years of military service had built into him a set of reflexes around authority that were deeper than conscious thought. When someone in a position of power addresses you, you stop, you make your hands visible, you control your face, you comply. Not because you are afraid, but because you have been trained to understand that how you respond in the first 5 seconds of a confrontation determines everything that follows. He turned slowly, hands loose at his sides, and faced the 2 officers walking toward him. "Is there a problem?" His voice was level, unhurried. The voice of a man who had delivered bad news on battlefields and had learned that calm is not the absence of feeling, but the management of it. Holloway didn't answer. He asked for ID instead, which was a power move. James recognized immediately a way of establishing who was setting the terms of this interaction before it had properly begun. James produced his wallet from his back pocket, moving slowly and deliberately, and handed over his driver's license. Holloway read it. James Caldwell. He looked up. "What brings you to the plaza this morning?" "Mr. Caldwell, I live in the neighborhood. I'm taking a walk." You live here. The disbelief was written plainly across Holloway's face, the particular expression of a man who has already decided on an answer and is only going through the motions of asking the question. I know this neighborhood. I don't know you. I keep to myself, James said, and it was simply the truth. What happened next took less than 30 seconds. Holloway said there had been reports of someone matching James's description casing shops in the area, possibly planning a robbery, and the lie was so casually delivered, so seamlessly inserted into official-sounding language that someone who didn't know better might have believed it. James knew better. He had been trained in legal procedure and institutional language, and the specific grammar that authority uses when it is manufacturing justification rather than acting on genuine cause. But he also knew something else, something that no amount of training or discipline or decorated service could fully protect him from, which was that he was a black man in a public plaza being stopped by a white police officer who had clearly decided something was wrong before he ever left his patrol car, and that arguing about the truth of the casing report was not a strategy. It was a risk he could not afford. I haven't been casing anything, he said. I'm walking. Spread your legs. Hands on the wall. Holloway pointed to the storefront behind James, a boutique not yet open for the morning, its glass front reflecting the street fair crowd behind them. James turned toward the wall. He placed his hands against the glass. Standing with his back exposed, unable to see who was coming, pressed up against a surface he hadn't chosen. It was the opposite of everything his body had learned to need in order to feel safe, and for one sharp moment, he felt the specific wrongness of it in a way that had nothing to do with legal rights and everything to do with what had been done to him in his body, on 100 different days, in 100 different places, where safety was something he had to manufacture minute by minute. Reyes moved several paces away and opened her notebook. Phones were already out across the plaza. 5, then 8, then 12 people recording. Not because anyone had organized it, but because the human instinct to document wrongness is almost as old as the instinct to recognize it. Holloway's hands moved across James's back and shoulders with the deliberate thoroughness of a man who is making a point, rather than conducting a search pressing into pockets that were clearly empty. Checking the same areas twice, ensuring that everyone watching understood that this man was being treated as a suspect, regardless of whether there was any evidence to support it. And somewhere in the third or fourth pass of those hands, James's mind went somewhere else entirely. He was in a Humvee outside Fallujah in 2008, and the vehicle was filled with the smell of diesel and hot metal, and the particular anxiety that settles into a unit when they have been moving through hostile territory for too long without incident. Because experienced soldiers know that the absence of incident is not the same as safety. It is sometimes the shape that danger takes when it is being patient. His Sergeant Marcus Webb, a man from rural Georgia who could fix any vehicle with whatever materials were on hand, and who had once talked a suicidal private down from a roof using only sports statistics, was on the radio, his voice steady and professional, calling in their coordinates. Then there was an explosion. Not directly on them, not the kind of explosion that ends things in an instant, but close enough that the Humvee shook and the radio cut to static. And every person inside the vehicle had the same thought, in the same half-second, someone just died. And it could have been us, and it could still be us, and we have to keep moving. James was back in Denver before the memory fully formed. 3 seconds, maybe 4. He felt the concrete of the plaza under his shoes solid, present the texture of it real against the thin soles of his sneakers. He counted 4 slow breaths the way Dr. Moore had taught him. He identified 3 things. He could see the blue sky above the building across the street, a yellow balloon tied to a vendor's table 20 feet away. Reyes's hand moving across the page of her notebook. Here, now, Denver. Saturday morning. No IED, no Fallujah. The effort of that return, the precise, disciplined work of pulling himself back from 2008 to 2024, of managing a flashback that nobody watching could see, because it was happening entirely inside him, was invisible to every person in that plaza. The teenage girl who was crying while she filmed didn't see it. The older black man who had removed his hat and was holding it against his chest didn't see it. Holloway, standing behind him, certainly didn't see it, wouldn't have cared if he had. James stood against the wall, breathing present-controlled. Holloway found nothing because there was nothing to find. 15 minutes passed. Holloway circled James the way certain men circle things they want to dominate, not urgently, not with any specific purpose, but with the proprietary ease of someone who believes the space belongs to them. The crowd had grown to 40 or 50 people, a rough semicircle of witnesses, holding phones and exchanging looks and feeling collectively the slow accumulation of wrongness that comes from watching authority used against someone who has done nothing to warrant it. Reyes approached her partner, keeping her voice low. "Derek, 15 minutes, nothing on dispatch. Legally, we either charge him or release him." Holloway's response delivered without turning to look at her. "I'll release him when I decide he's learned his lesson." Later, that sentence would be played in a courtroom. Later, a prosecutor would pause after playing it and let it sit in the air for a full 5 seconds before asking the jury if they needed to hear it again. But in this moment in the plaza on a Saturday morning, it was simply the most honest thing Brad Holloway had said all day. "Kneel down," Holloway said, turning back to James. "You're being detained, which means you comply with my instructions. On your knees right here on the ground." There was no lawful basis for this order. There was no procedural justification, no safety consideration, no legitimate police purpose that required a detained person to kneel in a public plaza in front of 50 witnesses. It was a pure and deliberate act of domination, the specific calculation of a man who needed James to be physically lower than him in front of as many people as possible, who needed the image of this particular man with his particular bearing and his particular refusal to be afraid to be replaced by the image of a man on the ground, diminished beneath him. James understood all of this. He understood it with the clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime learning to read the difference between authority being exercised and authority being performed. And he understood with equal clarity that refusing meant arrest, which meant a night in jail and expensive legal fees and a record that would follow him and a story that would be told against him in ways he couldn't control. So he did the calculation that black men in America have been doing for generations, the cold, exhausting arithmetic of survival, and he knelt. The concrete was cold against his knees. He could feel the hardness of it, the unyielding pressure, the particular indignity of a surface that doesn't care what it's being used for. He had knelt in the sand outside Kandahar in the dark to check a soldier who had taken shrapnel through his thigh, pressing his hands against the wound and talking to the kid, 19 years old, from a small town in Ohio, about the baseball team they both followed, keeping his voice steady and calm while waiting for the medevac, trying to keep the kid's mind somewhere other than the blood pooling in the sand. He had knelt beside a hospital bed in Landstuhl, Germany, when they told him his sergeant didn't make it, and the grief had hit him so hard that he had to hold onto the bed frame to keep from going all the way to the floor. He had never knelt like this, not pressed down by someone else's need to feel powerful, not for an audience, not in a place where there was nothing to be done for anyone by being here. A woman's voice from the crowd, sharp and clear. He didn't do anything. He didn't do a single thing wrong. 53 people were filming. The first video was already uploading. Standing above James with the satisfied ease of a man who believes he has just demonstrated something important about the world. Holloway turned partially toward the crowd and began to speak in the loud, declarative tone of someone who has mistaken an audience for an agreement. "This is what respect looks like," he said, and his voice carried across the vendor booths and the still morning air with horrible clarity. "When someone with a badge tells you to do something, you do it. You don't ask questions, you don't stand there looking at me like I'm the problem, you comply. That's not complicated. That's not unreasonable. That's just the way things work when you're living in a city with laws." Nobody in the crowd agreed out loud, But nobody said anything yet either, because the particular silence of people who are witnessing something wrong but haven't yet decided what to do about it has its own weight, its own texture. It's the silence of 50 people doing math calculating risk, deciding whether to speak. Holloway kept going. People want to walk around acting like authority is optional, like you can pick and choose which rules apply to you, like the badge means whatever you want it to mean on any given day. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. Each sentence he delivered was, though he didn't understand this yet, a gift to the prosecution. Each sentence was being recorded from multiple angles by people who would later be subpoenaed as witnesses. Each sentence was the unguarded, undeniable expression of exactly what kind of man Brad Holloway was, and exactly what he believed the badge entitled him to do. In the second row of the growing crowd, an older black man, 60-something, a veterans organization cap on his head, removed the cap slowly and held it against his chest. And his face held a particular kind of grief that had nothing to do with surprise. Because what he was watching was not new, was not unprecedented, was part of a long and exhausting American story that he had been living in one form or another for his entire life. A teenage girl near the front was crying while she filmed tears streaming openly down her face, and she didn't stop filming. She kept the phone up and kept recording because she understood instinctively that the camera was the only power she had right now, and she was going to use it. Reyes had moved to the edge of the scene as far from Holloway as her presence as his partner allowed. Her notebook was in her hand, and she was writing with focused, deliberate strokes, getting down exact words, exact times, exact descriptions of each action, because Officer Diana Reyes had decided somewhere in the last 20 minutes that she was not going to be the person who let this disappear. The crowd was at 60 people now and growing. 3 blocks from the plaza, in a small storefront office above a dry cleaner, Sergeant Major Calvin Brooks, retired 58, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair, and the permanent slight squint of a man who spent 2 decades reading terrain for threats, was walking out of his nonprofit's Saturday volunteer session when his phone vibrated. He had founded the Colorado Veterans Transition Network 4 years ago, after noticing that the men and women he'd served with were showing up in his life, broken in ways that the VA wasn't equipped to address. Not just physically broken, but lost in the particular way that happens when a person has spent 20 years living inside a structure that told them exactly who they were and what they were for, and then one day that structure is gone, and nobody on the outside seems to know or care what it cost to be part of it. He ran the network out of his own savings, supplemented by small grants, and it was the most useful thing he had done since taking off his uniform, and on most Saturdays that feeling was enough. He read the text once, then again. "It's James Caldwell, downtown Plaza 15th and Market. Cop has him on his knees. Someone needs to get here." The person who sent it was a woman named Phyllis, 61, who volunteered with the network and who had been at the street fair buying earrings when she recognized a face she had seen in a framed photo on Brooks's office wall. A photo from a ceremony in Bagram, 2011. 3 officers standing in desert sun. One of them, James Caldwell, looking serious the way James always looked serious in photos. Phyllis had known immediately who he was and had sent the text before she fully processed what she was watching. Brooks handed his coffee to his adult daughter, Janelle, who was walking beside him, and said, "Go back to the car," and something in his voice, the particular tonality of a man shifting from civilian mode to something older and more practiced, made her not ask why. He moved through the morning foot traffic at a pace that looked like walking, but covered ground the way a march covers ground, purposeful and steady, already calculating distance time, what he would find when he arrived, what he would need to do. Simultaneously, without any coordination between them, the first video was going live on social media. 47 seconds of raw footage. No narration, just a man on his knees on concrete, and an officer standing over him, and a crowd of people whose body language communicated collectively and unmistakably that something was deeply wrong. Within 11 minutes, it had been shared 800 times, and the number was accelerating because the internet is very good at spreading the image of injustice when the image is clear enough and the injustice is undeniable enough, and this was both. Reyes checked dispatch one final time methodically, the way she had been checking it every few minutes since this started. Still nothing. No robbery reports, no casing complaints, no calls from any business in the plaza area about any person matching any description. She closed her notebook, looked at it for a moment, and then opened it again and wrote the time, 9:14 a.m. Brooks came around the corner of the plaza at 9:17 a.m. and took in the scene in the way soldiers and first responders take in scenes not as a single image, but as a series of tactical questions. Who? Where? What are the dynamics? What can be changed? What must be changed first? He saw James on his knees on the concrete, hands at his sides, the posture of a man enduring something rather than submitting to it. There was a difference, and Brooks could see it had seen it on men in situations far worse than this, that particular quality of controlled endurance that looks like resignation, only if you don't know what genuine resignation looks like. He saw Holloway standing over him, still talking to the crowd, still performing. He saw Reyes at the edge of the scene with her notebook, not watching her partner writing with focused attention. He saw 60 or 70 people in a rough arc phones raise the collective tension of a crowd that has seen something wrong and is waiting to understand what happens next. He walked directly to Holloway. Not around him, not toward the edge of the interaction, directly to him, stopping 3 feet away, close enough to make it a real conversation, and far enough away that no one could misread his intention. "That man has done nothing wrong," Brooks said, and his voice had the specific quality of someone who is not making a request. "This ends now." Holloway's reaction was immediate and reflexive. His hand drifted toward his belt, the unconscious reaching for certainty of a man whose certainty has just been challenged, and the crowd saw it, and the tension in the plaza spiked in the particular way that tension spikes when violence enters the range of possibility. Several people in the front row stepped back slightly. The teenage girl who had been crying stopped crying and her face went still. Before Holloway could speak, before he could escalate or deflect or manufacture a new justification, something shifted at the edge of the crowd. Captain Denise Okafor had been a block away when she got the alert through the same network that had reached Brooks, and she had arrived in civilian clothes. Dark jeans, a gray jacket, which meant nothing to the crowd but meant everything to the veterans already gathering because she carried herself in a way that was unmistakable to anyone who had served that particular quality of absolutely calibrated physical presence that comes from years of being the person others look to when things go wrong. She was 44, with natural hair, and an expression of focused calm that did not waver as she moved through the crowd and came to stand beside Brooks. "I was here when this started," she said clearly and directly at a volume the cameras could pick up. This man did nothing to cause this stop. There was no probable cause for detention. What you are watching is a violation of civil rights conducted in public on camera. More people arrived separately from different directions, each responding to texts that had spread through military networks, community networks, plain human networks of people who had seen the video or heard from someone who had, and they took positions around the perimeter of the scene, not aggressively, not threateningly, just present, standing, watching, making it plain through the simple fact of their numbers and their bearing that what was happening here was being witnessed and would not be forgotten. There were over 100 people in the plaza now. The street fair had effectively stopped. Vendors had left their booths. Strangers had set down their shopping, and the entire weight of the morning had concentrated on this single point. A man on his knees, an officer standing over him, and a community that had just decided it had seen enough. Holloway looked around. His partner was against him. The crowd was against him. A dozen veterans with decades of combined service were standing in a loose ring around the scene, and every camera in the plaza was pointed at his face, and he was for perhaps the first time in 19 years of wearing a badge genuinely alone. Holloway released James at 9:23 a.m. He said, "You're free," to go through clenched teeth in the tone of a man who believes that grudging permission is still a form of power, and James did not respond to the tone, did not acknowledge the bitterness in it, simply began the slow process of standing up. His legs were stiff. He had been on the concrete for nearly 12 minutes, and the cold had worked into his knees in that specific way that people his age understand as a conversation between the present moment and every injury that came before it. There was a second of dizziness as he rose, blood redistributing the world, tilting slightly before it steadied. He stood fully upright, shoulders back, chin level, not as performance, not as defiance, simply because that was how his body knew to exist, because 22 years had made that posture as natural as breathing. Calvin Brooks waited until James was fully on his feet. Then he raised his right arm. The salute was formal, exact, executed with the precision of a man who has rendered it thousands of times in earnest thumb along the forefinger. Hand flat arm at the correct angle held steady. It was the salute of a sergeant major honoring a superior officer, which was what it was, but it was also something larger than rank, something that the precise military formality only partially contained. Denise Okafor brought her arm up. A man to Brooks's left, whose veteran's cap identified him as Army, raised his arm. A woman near the back Navy insignia on her jacket saluted. Then something happened that was not planned, could not have been planned, had no choreographer and no coordinator, and no moment of collective decision. It simply moved through the crowd. The way certain things move through crowds, when the conditions are exactly right, like a flame, finding oxygen. An elderly white man near the front 70-something, a Korean War veteran's pin on his lapel hands that shook slightly with age, came to attention. He straightened his spine by degrees, one vertebra at a time, and brought his arm up slowly and held it there. And the effort it cost him was visible, and the intention behind the effort was visible, and it was one of the most dignified things anyone in that plaza had ever seen. His wife standing beside him did not know the military protocol for a salute, had never served, had no frame of reference for what the gesture formally meant, but she understood in the way that certain gestures transcend their technical meaning and become simply human, that something was being honored here, and she raised her arm. The teenage girl with the nose ring raised her arm. A father standing with his young son guided the boy's arm up and held it there, explaining something quietly in the boy's ear. The woman who had been crying while she filmed lowered her phone, raised her arm, and saluted. A man in business clothes who had been walking through the plaza on his way somewhere else stopped, watched for 3 seconds, and raised his arm. A vendor who had left her jewelry booth raised her arm. 40 people, then 70, then over 100. The silence that accompanied it was the most powerful thing about it. No chanting, no speeches, no organized noise. Just the quiet, sustained gesture of more than 100 human beings, choosing in the same moment to say without words that this man deserved to be seen, that his service had meant something, that what had been done to him was wrong, and that they were not going to pretend otherwise. James stood in the center of it, and his eyes closed for a moment, and when they opened, there were tears on his face. Not the tears of a man who is broken, not the release of someone who has been waiting to collapse, but something else, something rarer and harder to name. The tears of a person who has been invisible for a very long time, and has just unexpectedly been seen. The pale scar along his left forearm caught the morning light where his arm hung at his side, the mark from Kandahar, from the IED from the morning in 2009 that had taken 3 millimeters from his spine and given him 13 more years of service, visible now to anyone who was looking, which was everyone. Holloway stood apart alone, his partner beside the patrol car. The crowd's back effectively turned to him, and he understood in this moment not as a legal conclusion, not as an abstract consequence, but as a physical, immediate, undeniable reality, what he had done and what it had cost him. Not just today. Everything. The salutes held for 90 seconds. Then gradually arms lowered. Nobody spoke. Reyes filed her documentation with Internal Affairs at 11:47 a.m., less than 2 hours after returning to the station while Holloway was still in the building writing a version of the morning that bore only partial resemblance to the one captured by 11 independent cameras. Her report was 43 pages. It contained exact times, exact locations, verbatim quotes where she was certain of the words, paraphrased summaries where she wasn't, and a separate section documenting every attempt she had made to de-escalate the situation during the detention period and Holloway's response to each. She had been writing it in her head, she realized, since the moment Holloway first pointed at James through the windshield and said, "That's the kind of guy." Perhaps since before that. Perhaps since the third week of working with him, when she had begun keeping a personal log of incidents in a notebook she kept at home, having decided without fully articulating the decision that she might need it one day. Detective Sandra Wilkes was assigned to the case on Monday morning. She was 41 years old, 15 years on the force, and she had moved into internal affairs investigation specifically because she believed that the integrity of policing depended on the willingness of police to hold themselves to the same standards they imposed on others, a belief that, in her experience, was more often stated than practiced. She watched all 11 videos before she did anything else, watching each one twice, noting angles and timestamps, and the specific moments where Holloway's behavior crossed the line between aggressive policing and something that had no defensible justification. Then she pulled his file. The pattern was not new. In 4 years, there had been 6 prior incidents involving Holloway as the primary officer, where charges were eventually dismissed by prosecutors, who determined there was no probable cause for the original detention. In 3 of those cases, the individuals involved had filed civil complaints. In 2 of those 3, the city had paid quiet settlements, one for $18,000, one for $22,000, on the explicit condition that neither party discuss the case publicly, which meant that each settlement had effectively purchased Holloway another chapter of his career rather than ending it. Every one of the 6 prior incidents involved a person of color. Every one involved someone who had, in Holloway's incident reports, failed to respond appropriately to officer presence language that Wilkes had learned over 15 years was the departmental euphemism for "did not immediately show fear." Wilkes spent 3 days locating and contacting each of the prior complainants. Some of them had moved. Some of them had tried hard to put the experience behind them and did not initially want to revisit it. Some of them, when she explained what had happened in the plaza on Saturday and who else had come forward, said yes with a speed and decisiveness that told her they had been waiting for exactly this phone call and had never quite believed it would come. One by one, they agreed to provide statements. One by one, a case about a single Saturday morning became a case about a pattern of behavior stretching back 4 years that had been permitted to continue because the people it targeted had not had the visibility or the resources to stop it. Until now. Holloway arrived at his internal affairs interview 6 days after the plaza incident in the particular state of a man who has survived previous versions of this conversation and believes he can survive another. A confidence that was Wilkes noted as he settled into the chair across from her, already slightly different from the confidence she usually saw in officers who were going to be fine. This confidence had a brittle quality. It was being held together by something other than certainty. She was methodical. She started with the basics, establishing the timeline, walking him through the morning in the flattest possible language, asking him to confirm or dispute each element before moving to the next. She showed him Reyes's documentation. She showed him the dispatch records which confirmed unambiguously that no robbery report or casing complaint had been received for the plaza area in the 3 hours preceding the stop. She showed him 3 of the 11 videos, pausing each one at moments she had identified in advance: the fabrication of the casing report, the unlawful kneeling order, the speech to the crowd about people knowing their place. His lawyer seated beside him had advised him before they entered the room to answer only factual questions, to provide nothing that wasn't directly requested, and above all to say nothing about his reasoning or motivations. This was sound legal advice, the kind of advice that might have made this a longer and more complicated case to prosecute. Holloway lasted 38 minutes before he stopped following it. "I'm going to tell you something," he said, and his lawyer put a hand on his arm, which Holloway ignored. I knew when I stopped him that it wasn't by the book. Okay, I knew there was no dispatch report. But you want to know what I also knew? I knew that man was going to walk through that plaza like he owned it. Like my badge was something he could just look at and decide it didn't apply to him, and I wasn't going to let that stand. Wilkes let the silence go for a moment. So you fabricated a probable cause? Yes. And you ordered him to kneel without lawful basis? Yes. And you detained him for 23 minutes based on fabricated information? Yes. His voice had lost the brittle confidence. It had the particular quality of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has finally, against his own best interests, put it down. He needed to understand that the badge means something. That's all I was trying to do. Wilkes wrote for a moment in her notes without looking up. Mr. Holloway, the man you stopped, is a retired lieutenant colonel with 22 years of Army service, 3 tours in combat, and a Purple Heart. Do you understand that? A pause. I didn't know that. Does it matter? He opened his mouth. He closed it. It was without question the most important silence Brad Holloway had produced in 19 years of talking. The confession was filed as evidence. The Attorney General's office received the referral the following Thursday. Charges were filed within 10 days: abuse of authority, filing false reports, and civil rights violation. 3 counts each carrying potential federal penalties, each supported by video evidence, documented testimony, prior complaints, and a signed written confession that Holloway's own lawyer would later describe in a conversation he did not know was being recorded as the single most unnecessary document he had encountered in 20 years of criminal defense. The courtroom was quiet in the way that courtrooms are quiet when the outcome is not genuinely in doubt, but the proceedings must be completed regardless, a quiet that has weight and duration but not suspense. The evidence was overwhelming. The videos alone would have been sufficient. The videos, plus the confession, plus Reyes's 43-page documentation, plus the statements of 6 prior complainants whose experiences established a pattern rather than an isolated incident. It was, the prosecutor told her team in a meeting 2 days before opening arguments, the most thoroughly documented misconduct case she had prosecuted in 12 years. Reyes testified on the second day. She sat in the witness chair and described the morning with the focused, careful precision of someone who has spent 6 days preparing to say exactly what she observed and nothing more. No editorializing, no anger, no reaching for impact beyond the impact that the plain facts produced on their own. She described the moment Holloway pointed at James through the windshield. She described the dispatch checks she had run and what they showed and when. She described the fabricated casing report and the exact words Holloway used to deliver it. She described the kneeling order and her own attempt to end the detention. And then she said, without inflection, the sentence that made 3 jurors visibly react. He told me he would release Mr. Caldwell when he decided Mr. Caldwell had learned his lesson. James testified on the 3rd day. He described the morning the way he had described it to Detective Wilkes, calmly, factually, with the kind of precision that comes from a mind trained to observe and report accurately under conditions far more demanding than a courtroom. He did not perform grief. He did not seek sympathy. He described what had happened, and let what had happened speak for itself, which it did loudly and clearly in the silence that followed each answer. Mr. Caldwell, the prosecutor asked, did you commit any crime on the morning of September 14th? No. Did Officer Holloway tell you at any point what specific crime you were suspected of? He said, I had been casing shops for a robbery. Was that true? No. How do you know it wasn't true? A pause, brief and considered. Because I know what I was doing and I know what I wasn't doing. Holloway took the stand against his lawyer's advice. It went precisely as his lawyer had predicted it would go. Under cross-examination, trying to explain why James's bearing had registered to him as a threat, trying to articulate the logic behind 19 years of treating the badge as a mechanism for producing fear in others, he said things that each individually sounded like fragments of an argument, and collectively sounded like a confession to exactly the worldview the prosecution had been building its case around. The jury watched him speak and understood that this was not a man who had made a mistake on one morning. This was a man explaining with great sincerity and no self-awareness a philosophy. The jury deliberated for 4 hours and 20 minutes. Guilty on all 3 counts. The judge's statement before sentencing was not long, but it was exact the way certain things are exact when the person saying them has been thinking carefully about what needs to be said and is not going to waste words. Officer Holloway, you were given authority over others. That authority exists for one purpose: to protect people, including people who inconvenience you. People you don't like, people whose behavior you personally find objectionable. The moment you decided that authority existed to produce a particular emotional response in people who were doing nothing wrong, you stopped being a police officer and became something else entirely. And the people who came before James Caldwell, the 6 other individuals whose complaints were settled and buried before any of them could reach a courtroom, they deserved the same protection he has finally been able to receive. The fact that they didn't is a failure not just of yours, but of this system, and this sentence is in part a response to that broader failure. 20 months in federal prison, permanent bar from law enforcement, $65,000 restitution to James Caldwell. 3 of the 6 prior complainants to receive compensation through a city settlement to be negotiated within 60 days. The detective who had buried 2 of those earlier complaints placed under departmental review. Holloway sat with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set and his eyes on a point somewhere in the middle distance, and for the first time since the morning in the plaza, his face did not have the quality of a man who believes he is going to prevail. It had the quality of a man who has finally fully arrived at a consequence he spent years creating. His ex-wife's attorney filed within the week to terminate visitation rights. Her supporting documentation included the trial record and the sentencing statement and 3 years of complaints she had filed internally that the department had quietly declined to act on. The custody judge agreed without requiring a hearing. His colleagues at this precinct did not defend him publicly or privately. The union provided a lawyer and nothing else. The prior settlements, once disclosed as part of the broader review, triggered a city council response that moved faster than city councils usually move civilian oversight. Legislation, mandatory body cameras, a formal requirement that officers report partner misconduct rather than look away. Denver had been considering these measures for 2 years. The Caldwell case made them impossible to keep deferring. In 3 other cities, police departments pulled up the case as a training example within 60 days of the verdict. In one, a detective told her new recruit class study this case. Not for what Holloway did wrong. Study it for how long it went on, because every system around him let it go on. That's the part you're responsible for. James was present in the courtroom for the sentencing. He sat in the gallery beside Calvin Brooks, who had come in a suit and tie and said nothing during the proceedings, except when the sentence was read, a single quiet exhale that could have been relief or grief, or something that contained both. James did not smile when the gavel came down. He did not look satisfied. He looked, Brooks thought, like a man who had just completed something, not won, something completed it, and was already thinking about what came next. The notice from the court arrived on a Tuesday. Formal official, a certified letter informing James Caldwell that restitution in the amount of $65,000 had been ordered in his name and would be available for collection through the district court's administrative office within 30 business days. He read it at his kitchen table with his morning coffee, the same black coffee, the same exact change ritual, though now performed in his own apartment rather than a coffee shop. He read it twice, put it down, and then sat with it for 3 days. He thought about what $65,000 would mean in his life. He was working part-time consulting for a veterans transition program, living within his means, but not comfortably in an apartment that was functional rather than pleasant, in a neighborhood that was fine, rather than the neighborhood he had imagined living in when he used to imagine during long deployments what ordinary civilian life would feel like. The money would matter. It would change things concretely and meaningfully. He also thought about men he had known. Specifically, he thought about a 26-year-old named Darnell who had come through Calvin Brooks's program 8 months ago. Army 2 tours honorably discharged who had been arrested for disorderly conduct while having a PTSD episode in a parking lot in Aurora, who had no money for a lawyer who had pled guilty to a charge that would follow him on every job application for the rest of his life, because the alternative was a trial he couldn't afford to fight. James thought about how Darnell's life would have been different with a lawyer in his corner at that moment, and about how many other Darnells there were in Colorado right now in the same situation, making the same calculus, reaching the same desperate conclusion. He called the Colorado Veterans Legal Defense Fund on Thursday morning. He explained who he was. He said he wanted to donate the full restitution amount, $65,000, to their operations, specifically for legal representation for veterans facing criminal charges who couldn't afford counsel. The fund director, a woman named Patricia Simmons, was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. Then she said, "Sir, are you certain that amount?" "I'm certain," James said. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't contact press. It came out anyway because Patricia Simmons mentioned it at a board meeting, and one board member told another person, and within 10 days it was on social media, and then on local news, and the public response to the story more than doubled the fund's monthly donations in the weeks that followed, which meant that the $65,000 James had given effectively became something larger, a force multiplier, a stone dropped into a pond whose ripples he would never be able to fully trace, and that was exactly what he had intended. The call from Denver Police Commissioner David Hargrove came on a Wednesday afternoon 6 weeks after the sentencing, and James almost didn't answer it because he didn't recognize the number and had been managing his contact with the world carefully since the plaza, since his face and his story had become a thing that people wanted, pieces of a symbol he had not chosen and was not sure what to do with. He answered it. Hargrove was direct in the way of someone who has decided not to waste the other person's time with preamble. "We've created a position," he said, Director of Veteran Community Integration. The role would be to help this department understand military culture, really understand it, not the surface version, but what service does to a person, what it costs, what it leaves behind, why a veteran's body language in a public encounter might look like one thing and mean something entirely different. We want you to build that understanding from the ground up. James's first response was internal and immediate no. He did not want to be a symbol. He did not want his worst morning to become his professional identity. He did not want to spend the rest of his working life being the man who got forced onto his knees and then became a good news story about the power of community and the bending arc of justice. He had been a soldier, not a story. He spent a week with the question. He called Brooks, who listened, and then said, "You survived 22 years of people and situations that tried to break you, and none of them did it. Don't let one bad cop be the thing that finally stops you from being useful." He accepted the position. His first training session was 23 officers in a conference room on the 4th floor of the Central Precinct on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 months after the plaza. He walked in and set his materials on the table and did not introduce himself because the officers in the room knew who he was. Everyone in Denver knew who he was, and an introduction would have been a kind of performance that he had no interest in. He pulled up a single image on the screen at the front of the room, the plaza, the crowd of over 100 people saluting taken from the angle that showed James standing in the center of it, and the press of bodies around him, and the particular quality of that silence captured somehow even in a still photograph. He left it on the screen for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he said, "This is what happens when authority forgets what it's for. Not what happens to the officer. What happens to the community. They stop trusting that you're there for them, and they start filming everything because the camera is the only power they have. Your job, our job, is to be the kind of officer that people don't feel they need to film. Not because they're afraid to, but because they don't need to." He talked for 2 hours. He talked about hypervigilance and what it looks like from the outside. He talked about the grounding techniques veterans use in public when PTSD breaks through, and why those techniques might look to an untrained eye like someone who is unnervingly calm. He talked about what military bearing communicates and why it isn't the same as defiance. Near the end, a young officer near the back raised her hand. "How do we actually fix it, though, like in the moment?" James looked at her for a moment. "You already are," he said. "You're here asking that question. That's the fix starting." On the morning of September 14th, exactly 1 year after Holloway had told him to step over here, and the morning had gone where it went, James woke before his alarm for the first time without a nightmare pulling him out of sleep. He lay still for a moment, noting the absence. The way you note the absence of a sound that has been constant for so long that you have stopped hearing it consciously and only notice it when it stops. Then he got up, made coffee, dressed, and walked to the plaza. It was early, just past 7. The vendor booths from the Anniversary Street Fair not yet assembled the plaza, holding the particular hush of a public space before the public arrives. He walked to the spot he knew exactly where it was, could have found it in the dark, and stood there. He felt the concrete through the soles of his shoes. He counted 4 slow breaths. He named 3 things. He could see the fountain at the center of the plaza, not yet running for the morning, a pigeon picking at something near the far edge, the first fingers of sunlight coming between the buildings to the east and laying themselves across the ground in long gold bars. The PTSD flashback did not come. Not because it was gone, he understood after a year of working with Dr. Moore, that it was not gone, that it would likely never be fully gone, that healing from what he had carried was not a destination he would arrive at, but a practice he would maintain for the rest of his life. But because on this particular morning, standing in this particular place, he was simply and fully present, and the present moment had nothing in it that his body recognized as danger. That absence was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the most significant thing that had happened to him in months, and he let himself feel it. Calvin Brooks arrived at 7:40, coming around the corner in his good coat, hands in his pockets, and James heard his footsteps and did not turn because he knew them. Brooks had a particular walk, had always had it, even in combat boots on gravel in Bagram, a measured and deliberate tread that announced him as someone who had decided exactly where he was going before he took the first step. Brooks came and stood beside him, and they were quiet together for a while in the way of men who have known each other long enough that silence doesn't need filling. People began to arrive around 8, not in large numbers. This was not the organized commemoration that some community members had proposed, which James had quietly asked Brooks to redirect into a general veterans support fundraiser held elsewhere. This was something different, and smaller people who had been in the plaza a year ago and who found themselves walking toward it this morning, the way you walk toward something that mattered to you, not because anyone told you to, but because your body remembered. A few of the veterans who had saluted. The woman who had been buying jewelry at a vendor booth and had raised her arm anyway, not knowing military protocol, knowing only that something sacred was being honored. The older man with the Korean War pin moving more slowly than a year ago, his wife beside him. The teenage girl who had filmed while she was crying came alone and stood at the edge of the gathering, and she was not crying now. She was 20, James guessed, or just turning, and she had the particular expression of young people who have witnessed something they didn't expect to witness and have been changed by it in ways they are still in the process of understanding. She caught James's eye and nodded, and he nodded back, and that was sufficient. A woman he didn't recognize made her way through the small crowd toward him. She was in her mid-40s with the expression of someone who has been working up to a thing for a while and has finally decided to do it. She handed him a folded piece of paper, a letter he could see handwritten on plain-lined notebook paper, the kind of paper a teenager uses. "My son," she said. "He was 17 when he watched the video. He's in ROTC now. He wrote this for you and made me promise to give it to you if I ever saw you in person, and here I are." James took the letter. He unfolded it and read it standing there in the morning light with 30 people around him and the city waking up behind them, and the fountain starting up its daily run somewhere to his left. He read it twice the way he read things that mattered. Then he folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket close to his chest. He did not speak to the gathering. He looked at the people who had come one face at a time, unhurried, the way he had learned to look at things when he wanted to actually see them. And he nodded once, and that nod was everything he needed it to be. The scar along his left forearm caught the morning light when he raised his coffee cup, the same pale mark from Kandahar from 2009. From the morning the shrapnel came through, and the medevac came, and his sergeant held his hand on the helicopter and told him he was going to be fine. And his sergeant had been right, and James had spent the years since then deciding over and over again what being fine actually meant and what it was worth doing with. It was still there. It would always be there. He drank his coffee and watched his city wake up. Brad Holloway woke every morning in a federal corrections facility 60 miles north of Denver to the same gray ceiling. And on some of those mornings, the television in the common room was tuned to a news channel, and the plaza footage appeared. It had become one of those images that news programs reached for when discussing police accountability, the way certain images become shorthand for entire arguments, and on those mornings, Holloway found somewhere else to be. He did not watch the salute. He had watched it once in the first week alone on a phone a fellow inmate had let him borrow, and he had understood something in watching it that he had not understood in the plaza, which was that the crowd had not been saluting against him. They had simply been saluting for James, which was in its way a much more devastating thing to be excluded from than anger would have been. On the 4th floor of the Denver Police Department's central precinct, in an office that had been hastily furnished and still had a slight smell of fresh paint, James kept his desk in a particular order that anyone who had served with him would have recognized immediately. Everything parallel, everything accessible, nothing unnecessary. Beneath a stack of training materials he was preparing for the next class of recruits, there was his Purple Heart citation still in its original folder, still carrying the slightly formal language of military honor that he had once found difficult to read without thinking about the people who hadn't come home. He had put it there not for anyone who visited the office to see, not as a statement or a demonstration. He had put it there because it was the truest document he owned about what the work had cost, and keeping it under the work felt right, felt honest, felt like the correct relationship between the two things. The letter from the 17-year-old lived in the inside pocket of his jacket and went everywhere with him now, worn soft at the folds from the weeks of being opened and refolded. And James did not take it out often because he didn't need to. He knew what it said, but he carried it because he understood that one day, probably sooner than he expected, a young person in a new uniform would sit across from him and ask why the work still mattered when the work was this hard and this slow and this often discouraging. And on that day, James would not search for words. He would reach into his pocket and he would hand the letter over, and he would let a teenager from Denver explain it better than he ever could. If this story moved you, if it made you think about what service really means and what community really looks like when it decides to stand together, subscribe to our channel, leave a comment below, telling us about a moment when you saw a community show up for someone who needed it, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.